I decided to do my presentation on the science of criminal behavior. As everyone knows, the Positive School of Criminology is one of two schools in the criminal justice field. This presentation is a look at its history and why it's important. First, a look at Cesare Lombroso, father of criminal anthropology and the Positive School of Criminology. Lombroso was born November 6 in 1835 in Verona, Italy. He studied at the University of Padua, Vienna, and Paris from 1862 to 1876. He then became a professor at the University of Pavia for forensic medicine and hygiene and psychiatry later in 1896. He also took a position as a professor in criminal anthropology at the University of Turin in 1906. Before he became a professor, though, he had received a position in 1871 as a director of a mental asylum in Pesaro, Italy. Lombroso died October 19, 1909, in Turin, Italy, at the age of 73. Now, let's take a quick look at before Lombroso. The original brand of criminology belonged to philosophers, not scientists. Lombroso thought this was a mistake because he believed that penology should be the province of those who actually studied the human mind, rather than those who merely theorized about it. Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham were philosophers who formed the first basic school of criminology called the Classical School. That is widely used today, and it's the first organized theory of crime. This was the era of phrenology, and it gave Lombroso the idea towards his characterology. Lombroso's approach to characterology, which I'll go further into details later, is a direct descendant of phrenology. The idea of phrenology was pioneered by a Viennese physician, Franz Joseph Gale. The practice originated in Britain and spread to America and France in the 1830s, where it became far more successful. 19th century phrenologists called phrenology the only true science of the mind. This is due to the fact that students of phrenology attempted to link criminality and other human behaviors to the shapes of your skull. The idea was that the skull consisted of segments, each responsible for a single trait, like concentrativeness or combativeness. It involved using the bumps and contours of your skull to determine those various personality traits and psychological tendencies. Gale wasn't completely wrong in his hypothesis. In modern age now, we know that it's the brain that's separated into segments. But he was only slightly wrong in his original proposition. Like I said, the Classical School of Criminology was developed by two philosophers, Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. Classical criminology began during the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, which was also known as the Age of Reason. During this era, Europeans utilized capital punishment and consequences of crime and deviant behavior. Criminals would be punished excessively and harshly in this age. Bentham and Beccaria just moved for a different change of pace in crime and punishment. The classical school emphasizes that people make rational decisions to commit crimes based on the positive and negative outcomes before even committing them. The main theory involved in the classical school is that criminals have the rational choice, but they choose to act on them by ways of what gives you maximum pleasure and minimum pain. The study of classical school is based off of four basic principles. 1. Human beings have free will, and their actions are a result of their own choices. 2, them constantly considering the rewards and punishments are the major determinants of their choices. 3, the severity of the punishment should be determined by the severity of the crime. And lastly, punishment should be swift and appropriate to that crime. Beccaria and Bentham basically say that all humans are born innocent, but develop these criminal tendencies. The whole point of the classical school is to deter others from committing crimes. The Positive School, as Lombroso founded it, is opposite of the classical school. Lombroso believed that criminals are born, not made by external factors, and is based solely on punishing the guilty. Lombroso wrote a book called The Criminal Man and went through 5 editions as he continually expanded and revised it. It was written after Lombroso spent many months working on cadavers of executed criminals in an effort to determine scientifically whether criminals were physically any different from non-criminals. He tried to basically derive that it's nature, not nurture, that breeds a criminal. He used such tactics as characterology to develop his conclusions. Now, as I said, characterology is a descendant of phrenology, but only with slight differences. Characterology is the relationship between mental and physical characteristics, like phrenology, but it looks at the entire body, not just the skull. Lombroso is known for trying to relate certain physical characteristics, such as your jaw size and nose length, to criminal sociopathology, or the innate tendency of individuals towards sociopathy and criminal behavior. In his studies, he also sought to determine if some people were at a disadvantage by organic defects in intellectual abilities and reasoning capabilities. He believed that behaviors are deterministic. If he could figure it out, he could basically see if biological traits embedded in people's anatomies determine how these people act. He wanted to see if he could locate the determining factors of a criminal by comparing features of criminals that have already been found guilty. If he could accomplish this, he could prevent future criminals from committing crimes. Lombroso was partly inspired by the evolutionary and genetical studies and proposed that certain criminals had physical evidence of something called atavistic. Atavistic is defined as something relating to or characterized by reversion to something ancient or ancestral. In linguistics, the term atavism means evolutionary throwback. When Lombroso used the term in his studies, he based it on the notion that the criminals had physical traits that correlated to earlier humans, basically meaning that he had found out that the criminals' physical traits were that of Neanderthals or cavemen, such as the sloping foreheads, flat noses, long arms, etc. Atavistic or hereditary sort is reminiscent of earlier, more primitive stages of human evolution, where anomalies, called stigmatas by Lombroso, could be found. Now, there are many different meanings behind stigmata. Many of them mention sores on the body. When Lombroso coined the term, he meant it slightly differently. Lombroso exhaustively analyzed and classified the facial and bodily features that he believed were marks on the body of a criminal that he called a born criminal. This is what he called stigmata. Basically, that the marks would tell you if somebody would be a criminal or not. Lombroso's idea revolved around the idea that it's based on genetics who you are. Basically, people are born with a predisposition to be a criminal. He believed that criminals could be man or woman with the misfortune of entering the world bereft of civilized mind, capable of higher thoughts. In the Key Ideas of Criminology and Criminal Justice book, it's listed exactly what Lombroso identified as marks of a criminal. He concluded that some of the marks of a criminal are thick and crispy hair, dark skin, small craniums, receding foreheads, muscular weakness, and more. But all of these characteristics demonstrated that common criminals bear a strong resemblance to Australian Aborigines and Mongols. There are countless traits Lombroso listed in Stigmata of Criminals that he stated there if you matched 5 or more, you were classified as a criminal. Now, there are other traits as well. Of course, you have to have the basic traits I've already given you, but there are also some that weren't listed. Those of hypersensitivity to touch and pain, use of special criminal slang, grotesque expression of thoughts, tattoos, and even unemployment. Now, Lombroso also altered his theory of born criminals to a new form of classification separated into 3 different categories. 1. Born criminals. This group makes up about 30% of all criminals, and he still believes that they were just born into this life. Then you have abnormal criminals. This group includes the ones that he finds mentally disabled, and those who are paranoids, demented, or even alcoholics. Now, then, thirdly, he had the occasional criminals. There were the criminaloids, which this type of criminals had difficulties in childhood and occasionally behaved delinquently. The pseudo-criminals, these were insane people who only committed crimes in self-defense. Or there's the criminals out of habits. These were poorly educated and usually had social interactions with criminals as children. Now, a few years after Lombroso died, a British physician called Charles Goring published a book in which he gives his account on the research similar to Lombroso, which he conducted on over 3,000 English convicts. After analyzing all the data collected, he stated that there was no evidence that existed of physical criminal type, such as Lombroso and his disciples had declared. There was a lot of criticism of Lombroso's studies, primarily due to two issues. The first was his ambiguity of his definitions and classifications. Through his studies, he jumped from one classification to another and was constantly adding to make it hard for his people to follow his studies afterwards. The second was his non-scientific data collection and analysis. Now, he had a plethora of evidence that he gathered in multitudes of sources, but the way he sifted through it and just used whatever he found relevant rendered his study completely unreputable. So, in the end, he was discredited. In my conclusion, Lombroso had a great contribution towards criminal justice. Even though his studies were found discredited, he still helped through huge amounts. His execution in the matter of his studies may not have been completely done as well as they should have been, but he still opened the doors to other scientists to come and take over what he had started. Who knows? Maybe in time someone will come along and actually fulfill his ambitions and figure out what makes a criminal tick based on the ideas that Lombroso left behind. Only time will tell, but that's saying a lot.